good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. And thank you very much for coming to our first session of Simon Quick Takes. Simon Quick Takes was created in the style of a webinar to discuss an emerging trend or technology in a way that is memorable and accessible to a wider audience. All topics that we talk about are available in my Dean's Corner blog, where we feature both sort of discussions around topical subjects as well as faculty research, and have some alumni also representation. This is not going to be a deep dive into any of the issues given the time limit. The idea is that we want to give you a taste of the kinds of questions we're wrestling with at Simon in terms of our research and in terms of how we can use our expertise to actually shed light on some of these questions. And it's also a great way for us to share some of the research and knowledge creation that comes out of the Simon School, and gives our alumni, students, and general audience access to some of the top minds in the field, and whether it's finance, marketing, data analytics, operations, and how we actually perceive some of the topical issues that are hugging the headlines today. So without further ado, let me go on to today's topic. I'm Sevin Yeltekin, by the way, the Dean of Simon Business School, those of you who may not have met me yet. And I joined Simon about 2 years ago. By training, I'm a macroeconomist, and I have taught macroeconomics, global economics, and emerging markets for a long time. So this is definitely in my wheelhouse and bread and butter. I'm going to talk about inflation, energy prices, and the Federal Reserve. Particularly, I'm going to talk about 4 questions that we can consider. Inflation, big topic these days. Is it going to ease up? Why hasn't it eased up just yet? How has the Russian-Ukrainian crisis fueled inflation? What is the Federal Reserve's plan to reduce that inflation that we're seeing? And can we actually expect a soft landing for the economy, meaning that the Fed being able to reduce inflation at the same time, not plunging the economy into a recession? So let's look at some headline numbers. This is what we call headline inflation. This is the consumer price index that is published every month, but the rates that you're seeing over here are annualized. So when you look at the April rate, the April block, which is 8.3%, it's actually looking at the change, the percent change from April 2021 to April 2022. And as you can see, these are historically really high numbers. We haven't seen these kinds of inflation numbers in the last 40 years, since the early 80s. The US inflation was typically around 2%. What's really contributing lately? Gasoline, shelter or housing, and food were the largest contributors to the seasonally adjusted all items that you're seeing over here. So let's look at the Russian-Ukrainian crisis and inflation. On the left-hand side, we have the US regular retail gasoline prices, and on the right-hand side, we have the diesel prices. And the different lines on these graphs represent the different areas where we're seeing these prices in the United States, East Coast versus California versus Midwest, and so on. And the dotted line is actually the US average. A couple of things to note. Clearly, we see a precipitous incline here on both the diesel, retail gas, and on diesel right after the invasion of Ukraine. And at the same time, though, you'll also notice that even prior to that invasion and start of the war, we did see an upward trend in the prices. And that is really global oil prices were on the rise as the demand for gasoline outstripped production following pandemic lockdowns. Pulling out gasoline, being able to access reserves is not a very immediate thing that companies and oil producers and gas producers can do. So there's a lagged effect that we're seeing from the surge in demand relative to the supply. And before that could be answered, added onto it is the Ukrainian-Russian crisis that has really increased the prices over here. In March 2022, President Biden signs an executive order to ban import from Russian oil, natural gas, and coal. What kind of an impact did that particular sanction have? You have to remember that Russian oil is about 3% of total US imports of oil. So it doesn't actually constitute a major significant portion of the US imports, and it's only 1% of US oil supply overall. Nevertheless, we're still seeing gas prices that are above $4 a gallon, approaching $5, and above $5 in some places like California. And there's been an increase of 6.6% in the gasoline index back in February, the month of the invasion. This rise accounts for nearly a third of the consumer price index, which is what we use for inflation, at a monthly increase. So certainly had an impact, but I just wanted to put it into some context about how large that import is relative to the US supply and relative to the total US imports. But here's the thing. Are energy prices really the main culprit of that headline inflation that we're seeing? So we take that headline inflation. You saw the bar chart a second ago. This is the same thing you're seeing here on the blue line, right? About 8.5% in March, 8.3% in April, which is the latest number that we have. We take out energy and food from that equation and look at the rest of the items in the consumer price index basket. This is also called core inflation. It's typically the inflation that the Federal Reserve actually targets rather than the headline total inflation, because energy and food prices tend to be more volatile. And what we see is that there's certainly an increase in inflation due to energy and food. But as you can see, if we look at the core inflation by historical standards in the United States, core inflation has been rising too. In other words, it's not just food and energy that's contributing. There's been an overall increase in prices in the United States, even without that. The picture is quite different in Europe. If you look at especially the Euro area, where food and energy prices have been the major factor in the inflation rise, the picture is slightly different in the United States. Where's that coming from? That core inflation that have been rising and above, almost touching 6% in March before coming down a little bit towards 5% in April. It's really a cocktail of soaring demand and supply chain frictions, as well as quite an accommodative monetary policy, which also fuels demand. What do we mean by that? If you look at the personal savings rate in the United States, so these are households, these are not firms, these are not the retained earnings of corporations and so on, these are just households. It also doesn't have the US government in it. You'll see that there's been a very large increase in the savings rate out of disposable income. Now, that's not a surprise given the sort of the stimulus checks and extended unemployment insurance and other benefits that folks received due to the pandemic response with the CARES Act. And you see these savings rates really reach levels that we have not seen historically in the United States for a long time. US consumer saving rate is usually around 5%. We're not the biggest savers in the world. Other countries, especially Asian countries, tend to be much larger savers. But you can see that that has really increased, which created some disposable income that is coming from both the stimulus checks, but also coming from the fact that things like entertainment, services, travel, a lot of things that folks would spend money on was just simply not available during the pandemic. Here's the fiscal stimulus. Now looking at it from the government's perspective, this is the federal surplus or deficit. If it's negative, it's a deficit. If it's positive, it's a surplus that we're looking at as a percent of gross domestic product, or as a percentage of GDP. And again, the US government typically does not actually run many surpluses. Those of you who have been around during the Clinton second administration remember probably some of the conversations around the surplus that was happening in his second term. And I remember discussions around what will we do to the bond market if the bond market goes away because we've paid down the entire federal debt. Now those discussions sound really quaint at this moment. And as you can see, during recession, the Great Recession, the government certainly ran a large deficit, which touched almost 10%. But if you look at actually the stimulus and the deficit that we ran during the COVID pandemic, that has touched about 15%. How does this rank even more historically? If we look back actually to around World War II, we'll see that while we haven't reached those numbers of about 28%, 27%, this is one of the largest historical deficits that we've seen in the last 70, 80 years in the United States. So that fiscal stimulus adds on to that disposable income, props up the economy, and at the same time does create this sort of surging demand with the supply chain frictions, of course, creating an inflationary hotbed. At the same time, if you look at the monetary side of the equation, not just the fiscal side, but the monetary side of the equation, let's look at what is happening to the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. Now, for those of you who've not looked at this chart for a long time, since perhaps your Simon School days, I want to explain a little bit what is going on. Typically, monetary policy is conducted through the use of the Federal Reserve buying some assets or selling some assets to the market. And usually those assets had been historically just treasury bills, very short-term treasury securities. And as you can see, up until the Great Recession, all we see is that really the blue area, and that is securities held outright, US Treasury securities. And the balance, the asset side of the Federal Reserve had been about 800 billion or so, which is quite remarkable given the size of the US economy. Because of the turnover in money, the money multiplier, we don't need a lot of money in the United States injected into the, or liquidity injected into the economy to be able to do, anywhere between 15 to 20 trillion worth of transactions, which is the size of our GDP. After the during and after the Great Recession, what we see is a very large increase, first to 2 trillion, and then eventually almost touching sort of 3 trillion. Those were the first initial big quantitative easings that we had seen. And at the same time, the composition changes. Two things happen. One, assets that we had never seen before, for the first time in its history since 1913, established in 1913, the Federal Reserve starts buying mortgage-backed securities and debt securities that it had never really bought before. So the mortgage-backed securities, which is the green area, and the treasury securities, the treasury bonds and bills, ends up being really, really large after the Great Recession. But look what happens right during and after the pandemic. It actually makes the Great Recession quantitative easing pale in comparison. We have gone in a matter of about less than 20 years from 800 billion on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. We have increased that by tenfold, even more. Now we are above $8 trillion. And the other thing that's not actually seen here is that most of this blue area has long-term treasury securities that the Fed didn't used to actually trade very much. It usually did most of this trade, this monetary sort of intervention on the T-bill on the short run. So it's a different composition of securities, and we see some sort of, mortgage-backed securities over here as well. This is a huge amount of quantitative easing, coupled with the fiscal stimulus, coupled with the surge, which together define that surge in demand, coupled with the energy and food prices rising globally, is what we're seeing as a total effect on inflation. What's the Fed's plan to reduce inflation? In March of 2022, the Fed voted 8-1 to lift the federal funds rate, which is their key benchmark interest rate, from a target rate of 25 basis points or 0.25% to 50 basis points, and signaled that they would be doing about 6 other rate increases by the end of 2022 and going into 2023. So the median projection at that time of that particular announcement was that we would land about almost 2% by the end of 2022 for the federal funds rate, and close to 3% in 2023. The Fed also announced that it would reduce its balance sheet over the next year and reduce that treasury holding, the blue area that you have seen, as well as the green area, which is made up of mortgage-backed securities. So when these securities actually mature, the Fed is not going to reinvest the funds and actually let them run off the portfolio. What's that going to look like? Here again, the same graph that you saw on the left-hand side. This is the asset of the Federal Reserves. These are the securities that it holds. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing what the plan for reduction on that balance sheet is. There's a bit of a phase-in period. So it will start in June. You can see that in June, combined, the blue line, the blue bar here represents the redemption of the US Treasury securities, so about 30 billion a month, and a little bit above 15 billion for the agency mortgage-backed securities. So altogether about 45 billion a month for about 3 months, then moving all the way up to a collective about almost 100 billion a month, all the way down to end of 2023. This is a monetary contraction. It is the opposite of quantitative easing, is to reduce that kind of liquidity, raise interest rates, and to scale back some of that demand. Now, what happens to the economy when we do this? This is exactly what we worry about. Will the economy respond by lowering inflation, but still keeping growth going? Because ultimately that's the goal. That's called a soft landing. How do we bring down inflation to our target rate of about 2% without plunging the economy into a recession? Because the path there requires monetary contraction. In the beginning, in March, when they announced these plans, the Federal Reserve seemed a little bit more confident about being able to deliver a soft landing. Since then, most of the discussion in April, and we'll see what comes out of the meeting that's going to take place this week, they've backpedaled a little bit, acknowledging the difficulty of the road ahead. There is some precedent for a soft landing, but we've never been here before in the sense of energy prices rising, supply chain frictions, a continued pandemic, a war, global frictions. That combination, that cocktail, we have not really seen that before. So it's going to be a tough job for the Fed to follow. And here we are. What we have here is both the federal funds rate as well as what's happening to the economy, which is the blue line. And as you can see, that the economy with the recessions are the gray blocks over here. Every time the federal funds rate increases, we do see actually a recession, except for the areas that are outlined with a little red circle. So there are not many historically large increases in the interest rates that have not been followed by a recession. This is a really unprecedented time. We will be watching and we'll be trying to understand exactly how the buyback program is going to affect the economy, whether the supply chain frictions are going to be resolved. Depends a lot on sort of what's going to happen in energy and food prices. Those of you who might not be before the energy crisis looking at sort of Ukraine's production, Ukraine is one of the largest wheat producers in the world, especially supplying to North Africa, Middle East, and Europe. So food prices, we're seeing an increase in fertilizer prices as well, which is affecting the food prices. So it's not just purely energy, but also the food prices that are feeding into this inflationary numbers. Leave you with one thought. Can we expect, when we think about it, can we expect a soft economic landing? I talked about the fact that when the Federal Reserve decided to raise the federal funds rate, sort of the anticipation from the markets and from some of the discussions is that we would be reaching about 3% in the federal funds rate by the end of 2023. We have a Taylor rule. A Taylor rule, it's a rule that defines the federal funds rate given inflation target. Where is inflation today relative to its target, as well as the economic growth relative to what we call full employment. So full employment growth in the United States is roughly about 3% per annum, and the inflation target for the last at least 20 years or so has been about 2%. So given that target relative to where we are now, a little above 8%, and given our full employment GDP growth, where do we expect the federal funds rate to go? The federal funds rate says that we should really be at around 6 to 7%. That's a lot higher than the 3% that the markets are anticipating, but the Fed has signaled. Will we reach those levels? If we reach those levels, will there be a soft landing? Probably not, but it is a waiting and seeing game. Should we panic? Is this what we're going to look like? This is how much you have to pay for a roll of toilet paper or for perhaps a sandwich and a drink at a local bar. And these are, by the way, not just made up pictures. This is Venezuela from 2018 and Zimbabwe from 2008 when they had hyperinflation. I don't think we're going to get there. I don't think we're there. I don't want to spoil your lunch or your dinner, but it is definitely an unprecedented time that we need to keep an eye on how quantitative contraction impacts the economy, how the markets respond. There's been a lot of volatility in the markets as the Fed tries to find its own footing in this very difficult and perhaps very complex situation. So with that, I will stop and open it for Q&A, and please do use the Q&A function rather than the chat function to ask your questions. Let me stop sharing for a moment. What should the consumers be doing to try to ease this complicated situation? That's a very good question. What should the consumers be doing? So let me talk a little bit about who does inflation really affect? For a lot of people who are in that much higher income and wealth bracket, it's easier to, of course, diversify. It's easier to be able to kind of diversify by buying real assets that are going to withstand, inflation. Inflation is a very, very regressive tax. And a regressive tax in the sense that it's going to affect those who can't actually diversify their income and assets. And also for where do we see that? We see it for definitely low earners at the same time as retirees. Now, things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those government programs are indexed to inflation, but a lot of holdings of just basic income are not indexed to inflation. What can the consumers do? There are certain things that we can't really easily substitute away from. For example, energy, we still need to, warm our houses and be able to drive our cars. It's certainly the case that, in terms of our consumption, it's going to be very difficult to diversify away from that. But at the same time, it's certainly not a good idea to try to time the market either. So for those of us who have a little bit of length of time before retirement, sit tight. Wait for the kind of the long game. For those of us who are actually sort of thinking about, return to the office, do I go back to commuting? Do I go back to energy savings? Is definitely a good place to start doing some of those savings and putting money into perhaps at least a place where you can earn a little bit of fixed income would be a good way to go about it. As an incoming MBA student, how much do you think we'll be affected in finding jobs? Well, the job market right now is extremely strong. We're seeing a very, very low unemployment rate. It's low, it's about 3.6% or so is the unemployment rate. There's a lot of vacancies out there. Companies are definitely hiring. If the economy plunges into a recession, we had 1 quarter of negative growth. If that continues for a couple of more quarters, it will certainly be the case. And if the borrowing costs for firms, the interest rate starts to go up, there's certainly expected to be a bit of a pause on hiring, at least at the same rate that companies are doing right now. Will that necessarily mean that there won't be any jobs? No, of course not, because there's still growth in the economy. We still generate jobs in the US economy, even when the economy has a downturn. But at the same time, we may not see the exact tightness in the economy, in the labor market that we're seeing right now. So I would say that it's less about sort of perhaps the opportunities that will be out there, but more about the kind of the wage increases that we are seeing. So we'll have to watch and wait for that as well. Let's see. Do you remember that Biden reversed the changes to our energy policy that he made on day one to reduce inflation and defund Putin? The energy policy, if we're talking about the sanction side, are there alternatives to sanctions that are better off, without sort of punishing necessarily the consumer who are facing, large increases? He certainly allowed the reserves, the energy reserves, to be tapped. That's a hard trade-off, to be perfectly honest. Is it really affecting Russia? Is it really helping with the war? Is that where we want to put our money and resources? That's really more of a societal and government and political question, as opposed to an economic. Looking at it from a purely economic lens, being able to have some independence and affiliated reserves, and also energy policies towards away from gas and oil, but that's a long term in the making. As an international student, can you give us some tips on how to manage personal finances in such inflationary conditions? That's going to have to be another webinar on its own, certainly. But as the interest rates in the United States go up, that does turn the balance in terms of in terms of your home currency. So if you're borrowing in your home currency to pay for US tuition, you might want to think twice about that if you have access to being able to borrow in more considerably better terms in US dollars, because that exchange rate equation, which I haven't even talked about at all in this section, is going to be an additional burden on folks borrowing in their own home country and then paying in US dollars. Did the Fed get this wrong? A lot of people are jumping on that bandwagon and saying that the Fed just waited too long to address the inflationary pressures, that the quantitative easing that had been done during the certainly the pandemic was maybe a little excessive and should have reversed tides. Hindsight is always 2020. There was a lot of concern when the economy went into a huge lockdown with the service sector, with not so much the high-tech service sector, but other financial services and so on, but especially kind of restaurants, travel, retail, really shutting down and not knowing where the pandemic is going to go. I think their foremost concern was to make sure that there wasn't a systemic-wide meltdown in the economy. Data, even in this day and age where we collect data, instantaneously, being able to get enough longevity, longitudinal data, and being able to assess it to see where exactly policy should be, is not an easy feat. So I don't want to, push them under the bus and say that they got it completely wrong. Should they have been a little bit more on the ball in terms of getting the inflationary, tapering of the balance a little bit early? Possibly. We saw this in 2005-06 and as well, when again there was a sort of a big surge in housing prices happening in the housing market. People were discussing whether it was a bubble or not, and again the Fed was blamed for keeping the interest rates a little bit too low too long. But then they increased the interest rates, and a lot of people blame the Fed for plunging the economy into the Great Recession, in addition to all the other things that were happening in the housing market and mortgage-backed securities. So them if you do, them if you don't, but at the same time, it is an unprecedented time. So instead of playing the blame game and thinking we should have done, we could have done, looking at it sort of retroactively, I think we say in economics, that's a sunk cost. Where are we now? What do we know now? What does the outlook look like right now? And how can we make better, less blunt policy going forward? And that's what everybody is geared towards doing. Okay, the inflation is due to the confluence of several factors. When the COVID impact dramatically is reduced and China reopens, how long do you think the supply chain will normalize? Oh my goodness, I don't have a black, sort of a very easy answer to that. There's definitely quite a bit of a backlog going on. There's one other thing about the supply chain and China opening. I mean, there's also the geopolitics of the relationship between the United States and China. So this is going to be a, in terms of kind of looking at both the supply chain issues, but also looking at kind of what do we do with the tariffs that were put in place before? What do we do with some of the geopolitical tensions that are going on, both between the United States and China and on other regions of the world. So I don't expect it to be this big whooshing sound as soon as the supply chain in China opens, but hopefully, all economic forces and incentives are in place to try to open those supply chains as quickly as possible. So I don't expect it to be a delay. I don't expect it to be an extremely slow thing, but I don't expect an overnight miracle as well. It will probably take about a year or so for it to at least return to its normal function. Is the Fed stimulus set to contain inflation or encourage consumerism? I don't know what you mean by the Fed stimulus, because the stimulus actually comes from, so let's get some of the terminology straight. the fiscal stimulus is from the fiscal side, from the treasury, from the government side of the equation. The Federal Reserve's kind of increase in the quantitative easing, if that's what we're referring to, is it set to contain inflation? No stimulus ever is set to contain inflation, whether it's the fiscal stimulus to give income, to prop up income to households or companies, or the quantitative easing on the Federal Reserve side. Look, economics is not black and white. It's all about trade-offs, right? We're trying to kind of make sure that the economy survives the pandemic, the fiscal stimulus, and folks who have lost their jobs and who are not able to go to work, folks who have children, young children at home, folks who are sick and affected by COVID, businesses affected by COVID, states, healthcare affected by COVID. We tried to do a stimulus so that the economy kept on going and people didn't suffer huge consequences from lost income. We knew that that had some negative externalities, possibly like inflation when things return to normal, possibly other distortions that we hadn't quite measured. But it's never black and white. We have to work around those trade-offs, and the responses are never that quick. So while we're trying to fix policy here, we're still showing the effects of a policy that was done a year ago. So it's not a precise science in terms of getting the timing right. So it's definitely not the 70s, right? The US economy is much more resilient. It has much more energy alternatives than it did before. Companies are much more resilient, are much more agile. Technology has progressed quite a bit, but at the same time, it is a confluence of factors that we had not really managed before. So I am optimistic. I don't want to destroy anybody's appetite for lunch or dinner or breakfast, but at the same time, it is a time for caution and watching and seeing what happens. Definitely not a time for rash action. With that, we are at the end of our time. I know I can see all of the questions coming in. I'm delighted for such an engaged audience and hope to see you in our next Simon Quick Takes. We will be continuing to address topical questions that is definitely grabbing the headlines and giving us a lot of food for thought and a lot of research ideas. So thank you for joining me today. And I wish you all a very pleasant rest of your day and rest of your evening. Thank you.